I'm Joshua, and I'm an INTP. And first and foremost, I would like to say thank you for viewing this video and consequently visiting my channel. The topic of this video will be on the cognitive functions, and this will be an exposition of my perception and the schema I have of the cognitive functions and what exactly they are and how they fit into the model I have of the brain's organizational patterns in terms of physiology and cognitive neuroscience, the traditional thought of Jung in synthesis and connection with the modern understanding of cognition and affective and perception by way of neuroscience and cognitive science. So first, the thinker I would like to talk about before I talk about Jung is Jean Piaget. And the reason I mention and the reason I need to talk about Jean Piaget because he has a book called On Intelligence, and it's where he breaks down his theoretical understanding of what intelligence and cognition is, not only in adolescence and developmental psychology of children, but also in adults. And he has a rather verbose and complex terminology for the things that he says. What most people know about Piaget is his developmental schema. However, Piaget was ultimately interested in how knowledge is constructed. He viewed knowledge as a process and viewed cognition as something that is built and structured from already ready-made patterns in the brain, which is something I've mentioned in other videos, but is restructured and organized according to environment and experience. And this tendency towards organizational noting he called schematization. And Piaget is the one that came up with the term schemas, or the idea that the brain makes schemas. Now, there is much in the advent of neuroscience and cognitive science in the modern sense, as in we do not find schemas per se as pockets of tissue and bundles of fiber in the brain, insofar as that the brain is viewed as a modular sort of system as a computer operating system is, but it is still a helpful analogy insofar as understanding that the brain still does make organizing patterns and nodes of thought. The brain is a dual processing system and is self-referential as well as cross-referential. And so it says, what does it know by way of its experience, and what does it know by its base structures that it comes into the world with, because there is a very real perceptual mode insofar as that we are visually based creatures and we are sensitive to photons. Our ears have a retardancy function in them insofar as things get closer they sound louder, and as they get farther away they sound dimmer or fainter, and this is for very real evolutionary reasons. Just that there are embodied bases that make up the structure of the brain insofar as us having imposable thumbs and being embodied things, that we do have a brain that has a very real organizational schema to it that is analogous to most higher mammals, and at the same time differentiated and unique to the genus of Homo sapiens and us being human beings. And it's to say that particularly that I view cognition as all stemming from the brain, even the cognitive functions. Now, I will not say that there's a space in the brain that is explicitly responsible for any one function. But I will say, given what I understand, and I have not looked at Dario Nardi's work, so don't take this as what I'm saying as a reference to his work, as that's something that's becoming increasingly more popular in the MBTI community, it is not of me to criticize his work, but I do not trust his work necessarily because it is by way of EKGs, and there is a limitation to what they can show in terms of neurophrenology. And I trust fMRIs and MRIs and different types of research per se in psychology that's a bit more stringent with its standards, and he's getting larger sample sizes and data sources, but the way in which he did his research is not completely scientifically reprehensible, but there are certain problems with it, but because some of the things he has in his research would not be able to be reproduced by others per se, because there's not a great amount of stringency in his work as I find in other literature, and I briefly looked at it, but I can't agree with him in this, that there are several modes and parts of the brain that are responsible for the activity and what we relate to as the cognitive functions. So it's to say that the cognitive functions are not necessarily systems in the brain like hardware, but they are patterns of information organization and the motivational schematization of motivational patterns of schematization. What I mean is that the cognitive functions seem to be networks of the brain that work in series with one another to do things with information, and is primarily to organize it. So I have language for the cognitive functions, but I don't think of the cognitive functions as pieces of the brain as classically thought, or as simply thought in, as you'll hear in some talk in the MBTI community. Also, I would say that the cognitive functions are not necessarily personalities in of themselves, as that's something that you'll hear in the MBTI landscape, nor do I think the cognitive functions are skills, which is something else you'll hear in the MBTI landscape. I think the cognitive functions are arrangement patterns of the neural networks in the brain, insofar as that the brain very much works like a symphony or an orchestra in terms of its orchestration of different modules and synapses and substrates to create phenomena and effects in the brain. And so when we're looking at any one action or behavior or tendency to organize information in a certain way in the brain, there is more than one system of the brain at work in this process, and I have not gotten as I would say set and convinced of these certain systems belonging to this cognitive function and these certain systems belonging to other cognitive functions. But what I do know is that intuitive types tend to rely on the precuneus and the default mode network of the brain, and that's something that is active within individuals that are intuitive, as that's something that's been shown to be active in individuals who load high in a personality dimension called openness to experience and daydreaming and several other in imagination and several other phenomena that we so tightly associate with intuition and an openness to things, to information and items largely outside of one's immediate experience, and being open to one's own internal and, objective landscape is something that's very indicative of the default mode network of the brain. The reason I do not try and say that this is this and this is that and this is this and this is that, ascribing specific systems to specific functions, yet I'm never going to say I'm never going to get there, but right now my understanding of cognitive science and neurophysiology is limited because the field is limited right now in its understanding, and I don't want to jump the gun in anything like that, so I won't really jump out there. It's not me being, I would say, modest or cautious in terms of the facts. I am being modest and cautious in terms of the logical conclusions that can be made from something. And it's not an incomplete idea, but the empirical side is not nearly as developed as the logical side, as obviously I'm an INTP and I lead with introverted thinking. So logically my schematization makes sense, but I'm waiting for the theory to be backed by some facts per se before I say specifically this should point to this and specifically this should point to that. But there are very real markers out in research that is already verifying much of the theoretical framework that I have, and I will continue to build on despite the slow comings in research and wait to see what needs to be revised with time. Now, it's to say this, moving from that, it's to say this, that one can look at any function and see it as lying in a system of the brain and being a constellation of subsystems. And what I mean as a system of the brain is that there are very real modes of perception, and they can be roughly broken down between the two hemispheres in terms of the bilateral symmetry of the brain, and saying that there is a pattern of thinking that is rather swift and vigilant. It is much more observant and is something that is associated with irrational thought, where there's a pattern that's a bit more, rational thought. It's much more swift, it's scrutinizing, it's projective, and it is abstracting and decontextualizing of information and compartmentalizing of information. And people associate this thought with the left hemisphere, and it is a rather crude analogy, but it does work because this is something that can be seen in the prefrontal cortex's activity in terms of how it deals with information. And so this is the objectative center of the brain, and this is the first distinction I make in some respects. The objective center of the brain, or what we would consider objectivity, to where the other side that is much more vigilant, slow, lacks language in terms of syntactical or symbol systems of language, typically communicates through inclination, hunches, and leanings, and is much more traceable along the substrates of embodied phenomena such as gut feelings, pain, elation, shock and fright, and different things. This would and emotional resonance and emotional patternization creation, and intuitively led metaphorical structuring is something that is in the right frontal lobes and the right parietal regions of the brain, and is something that is typically concerned with associated with the irrational mode of thinking, and this is what I create as in qualitative. Now, qualitative and objective or objectative is the splitting between thinking and feeling, roughly, and the thinking functions fall in the objectative landscape, though that there is a very real tendency, especially between NTs, to be just as much using of the entire frontal regions of their brains to make decisions, as will be noted in greater detail if I make another video on something like this with more and more research. Give this maybe another 2 years to come out. I really mean this, but it's to say that the functions, in terms of the cognitive functions, introverted thinking and extroverted thinking, sit in the objectative sphere, with a leaning towards the right hemisphere, and the connective ability those two things have, those two hemispheres have with one another, to where feeling is more towards the right and more towards the back in the midbrain, and is qualitative in its interpretation of information, and I don't want to use interpretation because it's perception of information, and creates patterns by that way. Thinking creates objective patternizations of information, or what is classically considered objective patternizations of information. And the reason I'm using the word patternization is because there's a very real phenomenon of the brain to seek out patterns and symmetry within its environment. And I think that every function contributes to this process in some way in its given arrangement and magnitude. And the objectative functions create objective patternizations of information, as in they are relating objects and properties and principles to one another, and trying to interpret patterns from that standpoint, using as little as possible of their emotionally linked side of the brain as they can to really structure information and their actions and how to act on and use information, to where the feeling functions are far more qualitative and create emotional patternization. And this is where I think the classic thought of the feeling functions as being concerned with emotions differs, because there's a nuance here, and is where I agree with Jung that the feeling functions are rational functions, but they are analytical, which is not something that you would hear typically associated with them. But they are analytical in this way that they're looking for emotional, existentially communicated information, per se, things that are meaning-based and affirming of the self, or the values and moral and ethical precepts that the individual holds. It's looking for things that align with that, or affirm or negate those things, and are creating patterns by those things. So it's emotional patternization. Objective patternization and emotional patternization is the rough dichotomy between thinking and feeling. And this is how I conceptualize the cognitive functions. So there is the camp of the rational functions. The rational functions fall in the objectative versus the qualitative, because my schema of the cognitive functions is that there is no such thing as pure objectivity, but there is a perceptual landscape at which one lives in, and that colors everyone's differentiation and reception of information in the environment. And it's the receiving and differentiation of information in the environment that really colors the landscape of the person's perceptual experience and their existence. And it's this thing that is sort of, when I say motivational, is so far as that it skews people to look at certain types, given the cognitive functions place in their functional stack, it skews their perception to look for specific types of information within the environment and to create patterns out of this information over other information, and creating patterns of that. Now, it's to say, moving on from thinking and feeling roughly, or the rational functions, to the perception functions, is that receptivity, the differentiation of information, really lies in the rational functions, insofar as they decide, in a sense, how this information is going to be organized and how the patterns are going to be constructed. However, the reception of information is, by and large, the role of the perception functions. It is why Jung would describe them as passive, non-aggressive towards experience, because they are very much a type of mode in the brain that is always taking in information and stimulus. That the memory and the storehouses of memory are very much, in some way, because there's different modes and types of memory in the brain, but there are several types of memory that I think that coalesce and come together in certain magnitudes, ones being more prominent than others, to create, in respects to systems like the default mode network, or certain other networks within the midbrain that create our disposition towards intuition versus sensing. and it's memory in conjunction with the memory networks in conjunction with other perceptory networks that make up the intuition landscape and the sensing landscape, and is where I use the language of interpretive versus empirical, which is something that I had long before Michael Pierce came out with it, but I find, interestingly enough, as me being polar introverted intuition and dominant introverted thinking, that we would really arrive at a lot of the same ideas. However, from very different vantage points, it seems like, as I think he has dived into some cognitive science and neuroscience, or I can't really tell, but I know he mostly studies philosophy, but I find it very strange that we looked at completely different information, though we both look at Jung's work very heavily, that we came to the same conclusions in a lot of ways, and I find that terminology fits more aptly saying this, that the intuitive functions are interpretative because they do distort information in terms of they're not immediately concerned with objects, and they look beyond objects to find out what can be associated and synthesized amongst the properties and the invariant elements, or what it perceives or takes from that object as the invariant elements of that object, what it can do with those things. Intuition is very much a form of expectation, and it is a passive mode of watching and drinking in things from the environment and not making judgments on them, having these things collect in a storehouse of RAM, essentially, within the brain, and these bits and nodes of information being tied together by the subconscious mind and then being given back to the conscious mind to act on and do things with. And this is the interpretive landscape of introverted intuition and extroverted intuition. There are several ways that these things can be split, but these are the rough dichotomies that I've come up with. And the empirical landscape would be insofar as that the same types of memory networks in the brain are more readily associated with the visual systems and the auditory and kinesthetic systems of the embodied traits of someone, and that would be sensing types, and they are much more embodied, but they are also cognitively based, as they do have components that I find are very much in the frontal regions of the brain, but very much in the back, the midbrain, and the lower brain, insofar as the hypothalamus and other areas that contribute to one's tendency to pay attention to objects in the environment, go off of color schematization, and be concerned with orientating objects in their most physical sense to one another, and imagining how they move in space and how one can act on these objects and do things with them, though that's something that's also indicative of extroverted thinking, interestingly enough. Now, those are the rough dichotomies that you have. I have qualitative, I have objective, I have interpretive, and I have empirical, and I think each of the functions fit in these schemas, and it's to get to the point of the theory of motivational schematizations, and that is that the cognitive functions do bias one's tendency to observe or perceive certain types of information within the environment. And there is a very real correlation to our values and what our immediate goals are and our perception of the environment. It's why when they're looking for their keys, they could be right in front of them, but one can't see them. Or when one's thinking about buying a certain kind of car, they walk out into the environment and they see more of these types of cars, or they see this person owns this type of car or anything like that. Why, when one is sexually aroused, that they see more sexually promising partners out in the pool of people walking around, or they notice more sexually interesting men or females per se. It's our perception is skewed by way of our motivational schemas in our brain and our current value systems, the lower ordered value systems insofar as in a powerful way. So the lower ordered value systems, which I mean is our need to eat, to reproduce, to climb up a dominance hierarchy, and to find meaning. I think that these things very much supersede can supersede and override our perceptive schema of that the cognitive functions create, but the cognitive functions themselves, and also what I called superordinate traits in another video, these things can do that, but I find very really that the cognitive functions tend to not tell me what a person will do or what they think, but the why. And because they do have a very strong role, and I think, in the organization of information and the construction of patterns of information, and really what gets kept and what's cast aside, very really. And what comes to the conscious mind and what goes to the subconscious mind, it's this interesting arrangement per se that I think is what makes up the cognitive function landscape, and why I say that they really are systems of the brain acting in cohesion with one another in a very symphony-like manner to create sort of modules and nodes of organized pockets of information, which Piaget called schemas. And I think that what Piaget said about schemas insofar as that they come from innate sources, but we do this process of constructing our knowledge and ourselves up, sort of the children build themselves up from the information given to them in the environment based off of the already pre-ready-made action structures that they come with in terms of reflexes and their own temperament per se, that the cognitive functions are the things that are creating the schemas. They are in conjunction with I think that they are the reflexive agencies and the temperamental patterns that will sit there and arrange things in terms of one's experience, that given certain events, the cognitive functions do work to organize the psyche and saying that these relevant bits go here, that these bits go there. Oftentimes the cognitive functions are looked at as sub-personalities that drive and move the individual, but I think that they're sub-personalities that drive and move perception to where individuals get cues from their environment and from their other superordinate traits and what it means to be human, and the cognitive functions move in and out with these things sort of like in a warehouse manner and arrange information when they are properly functioning or properly working and not inflated or anything, and that our shadow functions are better assimilated to our persona and self, that they very much work with our drives and our motivations as people. And I think that's why all people at bottom want the same things, but how they go about getting those things or what they think that those things are differ per se, because the cognitive functions are certainly and very really skewing necessarily what is important, what's not important from the environment, and we get what's important from our value structure, our value functions, but what our value function says aren't important, the brain thinks is important, and that's in the subconscious space, because the conscious mind cannot take in the voluminous amounts of information out in the environment. We're constantly being bombarded with information in various ways and in different forms and shape, but the unconscious mind is very much receiving all that information and making sense of it, and at the same time orchestrating the unconscious functions of our body to continually help us maintain an equilibrated or roughly equilibrated state given certain parameters per se. And the cognitive functions are working in this system of our being, our bodies, and our brains to help the brain not be overloaded with information, and to help the brain, in a sense, make a complex so that it does not have to deal with all things at all times, or else we would be in a state of constant shock. It's why when people say that one, that you only use 10% of the brain, that's a neuromythology, that's not true. Two, that one can be all in all, or that there was a time before, long before, that we were all things and we were one and whatever. That's just not true given a material standpoint, because very much as organisms, we have a caloric tax, and that means that there's only so many calories and sugar that we can use to do things per se, and so we don't want, and there's a limited amount of resources in the environment per se, and there are very real selection and environmental pressures put on us by way of these things, so that there has to be sort of a system and organization of the way the brain is going to work and arrange information, and essentially make the human neurophonology in conjunction with the human body for it to be a successful go at it. And it's why you see in terms of evolutionary history that the first things are fairly dumb and inefficient in their anatomical structures, and very really dinosaurs and dinoflagella and all these different things, bacteria and things like that are very well made. But it seems like when you get more complex, dinosaurs died off essentially because they were poorly made things, insofar as that they were so big in volume that the surface area of their body and the length of their tendons and bones, because of very real forces of gravity in terms of physics, the rotational inertia at which it would take to move their bodies required a great deal of food and resources. Also, the size of their bodies did not really permit for them to get things like feather and hair per se, because what you have to make hair and how much DNA and energy you have to, there's just a very real sort of, one can think of it as a slide rule or an invisible accountant working behind the schemes of nature to say that if you tip things over here on the scale, you have to lose this, you have to get a little more of that, you have to lose this, you have to lose that. So there has been a tendency to, in nature, to organize the makeup of things by way of success. And when you want to select for certain traits, as in terms of humans, for us to have very strong cognitive capacities, you have to make it to where when the brain is online, or the conscious part of the brain is online, it has very real fixed modes of looking for information that will be most salient and successful to it. And I think more so because we are social creatures and live in communities and tribes, it is going to specialize these things and create niches out of these, and this is where you get personalities per se, or the way the cognitive functions. Well, I think is where you get personalities. I still quite haven't hit the nail on the head to what specifically was the evolution of personality, but I do know that in other species, such as fruit flies and such as other things, there is an interesting rough dichotomy. You can find introversion and extroversion in animals, per se, even dogs and cats. You can find that in mammals. You can find that almost everywhere. Also, you can find that there is very real tendencies, per se, by way of their minds, given the already instinctual patterns that they come with, to be a little more exploratory, to be a little more aggressive, to be a little more agreeable. That's sort of where the Big Five model comes from, insofar as that researchers were able to see through the human lexicon of words that people tended to use these words to describe certain characteristics, and that these things did have very real biological underpinnings, and you find them in other lower ordered forms or species, lower ordered forms in terms of cognition, and other species of animals, that these things have to have a genetic basis and have to be in humans also if we're evolved things, and that sure enough we're finding things in neuroscience and genetics that corroborate this thought. Now, this is all to say that the brain, the cognitive functions, bias and skew the brain towards information, and there are very real salient evolutionary reasons for that, as you don't want yourself to pay attention to everything, because if you were driving down the road and you paid attention to everything in the environment and you did not have the ability to have a certain type of skewed focus and finite lens with a small amount of vigilance within the peripheries, you would kill yourself all the time, and you just wouldn't make it in this world very really, because it's just too complex and there's too much information at one time.